can understand why people feel divided on the war in Iran. It depends very much on your vantage point. If you are someone in the US or in Australia and your alternative to war is peace, then of course you're going to be opposed to war. But if you are in Iran and your alternative to war is oppression, then probably what you will want is any alternative except further oppression. In fact, the only thing you'll want is an end to that oppression. So the fact that this war came in the form of an attack by Israel, by the US, on Iran, it came as a preemptive strike, that in itself would have brought relief to people who have suffered under a regime that felt like it would never end. So the oppression that has now come to an end under the leader or the figurehead who has since been taken out, that would have been a welcome change or a welcome relief. What happens now, however, remains to be seen. But how we ended up here, that was not an accident. This attack, that would have been planned a very long time ago. The question would have just been about when. When would be the opportune time to strike as a coordinated effort between Israel and the US? When would be the right time to put that plan into action? And I'm going to assume it was because they had intel about where the Ayatollah would be, which is what would have triggered that plan or that operation to be put into place. What is happening now with the retaliation from Iran? That plan was also forged a long time ago. June last year, the US launched an airstrike on Iran, and what the Trump administration said was that this strike was intended to take out Iran's nuclear sites. So the US had alleged for years, well, decades really, they have an ongoing, like a long history with Iran about whether or not Iran is developing nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction or nuclear capabilities. And this mistrust between the US government and those in power in Iran, that is what sort of legitimizes the US's intention to attack Iran or to bomb Iran. So in June last year, that is exactly what they did. So they launched airstrikes on Iran to take out the facilities, the nuclear facilities. And that was considered a successful operation because they did take out these facilities and these sites, and Iran did not retaliate. So that was an unprompted attack. So it was a preemptive strike, which did not end in war, it did not trigger a war. It was simply absorbed by Iran. So their nuclear capabilities or their program was severely harmed or set back because of that airstrike. So whether or not they had actual nuclear weapons is almost, it's not irrelevant, but it is secondary to the fact that the US missiles did do damage. It did take out those facilities, and it set Iran back when it comes to their weapon development or weapons development program. And the reason why that becomes important is because you have to imagine that this is a country that is already or has been under extreme pressure. The people of that country were already under extreme pressure because of their oppressive government. So the Ayatollah, who has now been taken out, he had been in power for decades. The majority of the population is a young population, so they are under the age of 25. And what that means is they have no allegiance to a leader who they did not elect, they did not vote for, who was already in power when they were born, and who has claimed to have absolute power. Absolute power in the sense that he dictates the rules, the laws, the freedoms that people have, and crucially, the handling of money or the management of the economy. The mismanagement of Iran's economy is a term that comes up a lot when the US is talking about the regime. But it's such a misnomer to call it mismanagement of the economy. It really isn't complicated to understand. What has happened, or what is still happening, is that number one, there were sanctions that were put on Iran by the UN, by the US, which embargoed a lot of their goods, which blocked trade with that country, and which severely diminished their currency. So their currency is basically worthless. So one US dollar buys now over 1 million riyals. So that's the Iranian currency. Over 1 million. So I think now it's pushed up to 1.6 or 1.7. In December, it reached an all-time low. So their currency was already something like 1 US dollar to 700,000 riyals or 800, 900, and it pushed all the way up to 1.3 million. So 1.3 of their currency could be exchanged for 1 US dollar. And you have to imagine that this country is trading in, goods in their like energy, their power sources. They are trading in US dollars. So their currency is worthless. And what their government is doing, or what the regime is doing, or the figureheads of this regime, what they were spending all of the money that was coming into that country, all of the money that existed for them, they were spending all of that money on weapons, on trying to build up this nuclear capability. And whether they were actually doing that or not is, I don't know. But really, what they were doing is not letting that money flow to the population. So the population was not able to use that money, which is why merchants, shopkeepers, business owners all were without an income and were without a business. They weren't able to operate. Therefore, they weren't able to feed their people. They weren't able to keep the economy lubricated because they weren't able to sell anything. They weren't able to produce anything, and people weren't able to buy anything. Inflation had skyrocketed. So people could not buy simple things, simple basic items to keep themselves and their families alive. They could not afford to purchase those things because of how weakened their currency had become. So their currency was basically worthless. Goods were not coming into the country. Everything was expensive, impossibly expensive. And on top of that, their regime leaders, so those who were in power or in government, they were an extremely restrictive government. They persecuted minority groups. They were in extreme violation of basic human rights and civil liberties. When you are trying to govern a country, but your operating system is using a set of rules or a set of laws that you cannot apply universally, that cannot be applied to the entire population equally. So some people have rights, some people don't. Some people are guaranteed particular freedoms, and some people aren't. There is no way that you can continue as a government without that becoming explicit and overt persecution of minority groups and or oppression. Of course, then, your set of rules becomes then a regime because it is oppressing certain people's freedoms whilst granting freedoms to others. And if you happen to be the wrong sex, the wrong religion, the wrong minority, if you happen to not believe what the leaders believe, but that is mandatory, meaning that it is necessary for you as a political subject to believe the same things in the same ideology, in the same religion, and the same interpretation of religion as the leader who is in power, as the figurehead of this regime. If that is the requirement, should you find yourself in disagreement or in opposition to their political views or their religious views, then if that is punishable by law, of course you will then by default be persecuted. You will become a persecuted minority because it is against the law for you to be as you are, to think the way you think, to believe what you believe, because the government has made it so, because the government has said it is now unacceptable, illegal, and also punishable to be anything except what our leader is. So if you are not a radical, fundamental Muslim who believes that you should relinquish or give up your right to education, your right to participate politically, your right to expression, to express yourself, your right to live and earn an income, the right to have a job. If your government is telling you all of those things and you aren't able to have a way of life, you aren't able to live, not only with any degree of success, you aren't able to live at all. You aren't able to educate yourself, you aren't able to work, you aren't able to leave your home and come home knowing that you will be safe and being able to guarantee the safety of yourself or your children or your family or anyone that you know. When that is the case, then of course there is going to be instability because people will not be happy. They will be extremely dissatisfied with a version of governance that looks like this. And this has been the case in Iran for years, for decades, for many, many, many years. People have responded differently to this situation. Most of the people who were born after the Ayatollah came into power, they do not have allegiance to this person. They don't have allegiance to that form of governance. And they definitely don't find it enjoyable or appealing or have any loyalty to abiding by a system that will not take care of them. If the government that you are living under, which makes the rules, which enforces the rules, if they aren't able to give you a good life, why would you be loyal to that government? And if that government cannot give you any autonomy over your own life, they can't give you freedom of choice, you aren't able to dictate in any capacity what your life will be, what it will look like, when you have no agency whatsoever over what happens to you because you are under threat every day, because your currency is worthless, because opportunities that you feel should be open to you, such as educating yourself, working, participating in society, when you are being denied of all of that. And then on top of that, when members of your family start being killed, when your life is under threat, the lives of your friends, the lives of your family, the lives of anyone that you know, when every day becomes a risk because you don't know whether your life might end, and you also know that there will be no justice should your life suddenly come to an end because it is taken from you by those who are in power. When this happens, of course, the natural response, especially when this is happening to the majority of the population, of course, people will protest. What the Iranian government described it as was riots. People were rioting.